At RTX, we believe no challenge is too great, no question too big, no answer out of reach. That's why we never stop striving. Our global team works across Collins Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney, and Raytheon to inspire, innovate, and drive progress for generations to come. Together, we push the boundaries of known science and find new ways to connect and protect our world. Visit rtx.com to learn more.
I'm Ben Watson, and welcome to Defense One Radio. Lauren C. Williams is a senior editor at Defense One. And Tom Novelli is Defense One's new senior reporter covering air and space warfare. This week, both of them reported from the Air and Space Force Association's Air, Space, and Cyber Conference. Lauren, welcome back to Defense One Radio, and Tom, welcome to Defense One and to Defense One Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, just to be clear before we get going, the two of you are speaking to me actually from the conference on location, is that right?
Yes, we are hunkered down outside of the illustrious press office at the Gaylord.
Before we get into the newsmakers from this, I am kind of curious on a surface level. How did this year's event compare to past ones that either of you have attended? And in this case, we'll start with Lauren.
You know, I would say that there was a lot of energy. Attendance seemed high, especially on day one. I mean, maybe it's just me and I'm just showing, how long I've been at this, but it felt very calm. It was very busy still. There's a lot of people and lots of briefings that we attended, but it wasn't as, I would say, jittery as before. But that could just be a me thing, and that could be just maybe I'm finally getting the knack of these huge shows after all this time.
I would say, while this is my first AFA conference for Defense One, this is not my first AFA that I've attended and reported on. I think something that is really notable is that in March, AFA also has a conference in Colorado, and the timing of that conference was very strange. The Colorado conference each year is usually less attended than the one near Washington, D.C., due in part to the proximity and the close bases that are nearby and such, and more service members and more companies and contractors can get out here. But the Colorado one in March had a shadow over it because it was just in the wake of when travel restrictions and kind of DOJ-related measures were being put in place. So it was almost like a ghost town. It was like another ghost town in Colorado. It was very, very ill-attended, and it was due in part to those government restrictions. I understand that, there is still some travel restrictions in place, but the fact that it's here in D.C., there is much more attendance. And I did check those numbers as well with the Air and Space Forces Association. While the attendance for this fall one in D.C. is slightly lower than it was for the one in the fall of 24, it's definitely more attended than the one it was in Colorado. And I think a big part of that is there is a little bit more energy with this one too. There is also finally an Air Force secretary. When the Air Force Association had their conference in Colorado this past March, there wasn't a Air Force secretary who had been selected and confirmed yet. So a lot of new changes, and I think that that energy that Lauren was talking about is very clearly visible.
I find that kind of interesting, of course, in the wider, and we won't spend much time on this point, but the wider kind of dynamic of the Pentagon clamping down on public appearances. And so a lot of these conferences lately, the last couple months, we were concerned there might not be enough uniformed personnel. Sounds like this one, there were enough uniformed personnel to kind of have things to talk about. This, of course, I think is one of the higher profile ones as well. Don't we have AUSA coming up as well? So it's kind of like back-to-back, these two. Now to the headlines so far out of this conference. Here's what I'm tracking. I've got F-47 updates. I've got something of a hiccup for the new kid on the industrial block, Anduril. It looks like we have a window into how the Air and Space Force intelligence chiefs view the threat from China. There's sort of been looming over all this for the past several months, this upcoming early departure / retirement for Air Force Chief General David Alvin, after just 2 years on the job. And we've got some kind of new plans from the Chief of the Space Force that we will get into, but we'll start chronologically. And so I think that means we start with the F-47. Tom, what did you learn this week on that front?
Absolutely. The F-47 kind of the nugget of news that came out so far during the conference was that there was a new date that was floated of when it's supposed to take to the skies, of when we might see it get airborne and do some flight testing. And that date was set for 2028, which was earlier than anticipated. So that was a little bit of nugget of news that came out of General Alvin's speech, his keynote address. And I think another little nugget of news is that they started manufacturing on it. They started manufacturing on the first article of it. Kind of, underplaying that nugget of news is just this general message that we've seen throughout the entire conference, is that Air Force officers and Space Force officers want to go fast. They want to be able to create, new platforms, and they want to have these platforms available as soon as possible. So I think that having that little nugget of news, while it just moved the date ever so slightly, I think it does kind of reinforce what the Air Force is trying to pitch, that, we can have this kind of quote unquote peace through strength that Defense Secretary Hegseth is talking about. And, we're showing that we can move as quick as possible, or at least move faster than anticipated. Now, what is the reality of that going to look like? Totally different story, as we know that these programs are often played with cost issues, delays, etc. But it was interesting to see that that was kind of one of the big, announcements, if you will, from that keynote address.
And the F-47, of course, I should have probably mentioned this up front because I have to remind myself. This was a successor, intended to be a successor to the F-22 Raptor, and they're calling it a sixth-generation fighter jet. Do you have any idea what makes it a six? Like, why six? Why not just like a better five? Do you have any idea about that?
I don't. I don't have, a whole lot more insight into this, but again, I think it's just part of pitching that we have, the latest, most dominant technology at the forefront. Obviously, the F-47 rollout there is, something that I think was also very heavily interested in from the White House. I mean, we saw this announcement not coming from the Pentagon, right? If we roll back the tape a little bit to when this announcement was made, it was from the Oval Office. And, the F-47 nomenclature was very intentional. So I think the kind of messaging here, right, is that even though we don't have all of the details on what it's going to be fully capable of, that it is going to, help establish this kind of dominant, mindset when it comes to air superiority. So it'll be interesting to see what details come out of that. And more importantly, right now that the White House is taking a lot of invested interest in this program, I think expectations are really high. So everyone wants to be able to meet those deadlines and meet those cost expectations, but there's a lot of attention on it, and we'll be curious to see how that program rolls out.
And that's a program that's going to be run by Boeing for that aircraft. As far as we know, that's what he announced in March, I believe. And as I read up on it, it looks like this leads into our next question, actually, because that program is part of the Air Force's bigger Next Generation Air Dominance initiative. And that includes this new collaborative combat aircraft drone situation. I believe our next story sort of like bleeds into that a little bit. What's new with Anduril? This sort of, newer defense firm from Palmer Luckey, who, designed the Oculus headset and sold that to Facebook for $2 billion, now has his own defense firm. And it's brand new, working with drones. But what is new with them and their work on this Air Force collaborative combat aircraft program? Tom, I think you did a bit of reporting on that. That was previously in episodes we've talked about it, and it's kind of the robot wingman.
No, absolutely. I think we have to also roll back the tape a little bit in the sense that one of the biggest announcements, from AFA happened a day before AFA. So as we talk about CCAs and the idea of creating drone wingmen and having this kind of next generation of, air power, we saw another, company kind of getting into the conversation and into the fight about this. Lockheed Martin had unveiled from Skunkworks, which is, it's very, it works on very highly classified programs. They made a very rare announcement that they were releasing, and working on a prototype of their own CCA type offering, which is called Vectis. And I think that was really interesting because that happened just before AFA started and was part of the conversation, I think, that we had here. The idea here is that, CCAs are already, we're seeing this competition going on between General Atomics and Anduril. and they're working on meeting all those milestones and getting the expectations really high for this concept. General Atomics, it notched its first flight with its CCA offering a little while back, just kind of before AFA. Anduril hasn't gotten its off the ground yet, and so I think that was one of the conversations that we were talking about leading into this conference is what updates will they have on their CCA program. So as reporters were talking with company officials about this, we realized that their excuse, if you will, or their kind of explanation of why they haven't done their first flight was that they wanted to make their CCA first flight semi-autonomous. So to kind of explain, what's going on with that, General Atomics' first flight was not semi-autonomous. There was, somebody controlling it and was able to fly it from afar, but was able to show that it was flying. In this instance, Anduril said, we want to be able to click a button, have it go down the runway, take off, do its flight, come back, taxi, and land. So, the explanation there being that they kind of wanted to showcase the advancements in the technology that they could have. General Atomics, had a pretty impressive response to this when I reached out to them for comment. But the quote here was saying, "This is like saying I never expected my baby to crawl, but go straight from the crib to the Air Force marathon," end quote. So I think the interesting statement there from General Atomics is, okay, you're saying that you want this to be a semi-autonomous CCA. We know that ours will also be semi-autonomous in some capacity, but we're kind of going through the gradual processes to show that, And Anduril kind of saying that we haven't taken our first flight because they hadn't reached that and have had some glitches with making that semi-autonomous thing happen, I think really sparked an interesting conversation.
I think what's interesting here, Anduril's, working through its autonomous software. Aviation Week, Steve Trimble dropped a story at AFA, I think it was yesterday. It's basically saying that, like their autonomous software wouldn't even be used on their CCA platform. So you'll have, the RTX mission autonomy software is going to be what's used in General Atomics CCA offering, and Shield AI's autonomous software is going to be what's plugged in to Anduril. So, I mean, it's interesting to kind of see this development of this program, which is obviously, I think, could be absolutely a force multiplier and absolutely change the face of warfare. But as we see this develop and see how companies are working together, trying to build hardware, also build software, and you just kind of seeing how things are going to, they're going to mismatch. And the Air Force or the government, the military at large, is just going to pick what works best. So I'm curious to see how this works out and how this plays out, and then also to see how Anduril's software develops down the line.
At RTX, we believe no challenge is too great, no question too big, no answer out of reach. That's why we never stop striving. Our global team works across Collins Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney, and Raytheon to inspire, innovate, and drive progress for generations to come. Together, we push the boundaries of known science and find new ways to connect and protect our world. Visit rtx.com to learn more.
Now, Lauren, you wrote this week also about, of course, the Air and Space Force intel chiefs. Sort of updated view on the perceived threat from China. China, of course, is not exactly the Trump administration's number one focus right now, given the influx of cash to immigration enforcement, as well as, in terms of headline making, the Pentagon's naval buildup to kill alleged drug traffickers in the waters around Venezuela. Whether or not those strikes are legal is a different matter for a different episode. But what did we learn this week from AFA on that sort of legacy, great competition, great power competition, the China front that we kind of have been talking about basically since they started island building about a little more than a decade ago? How are these intel chiefs for the Air and Space Force? How are they viewing the threat from China now?
First, want to say that great power competition was not mentioned. I did not hear those words, but you can kind of you feel the vibes, as they say. But when it comes to the China threat, the big takeaway from the Air and Space Force intelligence chiefs was that it's more than Indo-PACOM. And, I'm guilty of this. And I think just in general in the defense space, when we're talking about the US competition with China, we are specifically talking about the Indo-Pacific region. And the chiefs were basically saying that it's everywhere. And that is particularly true when it comes to space and space capabilities and how rapidly China is developing those. There was mention of concern with respect to how quickly China, if they were to able to take advantage of reusable lift, how that could actually present a major challenge in terms of like how far they're getting in terms of developing their space capabilities, but just kind of pushing the notion that we have to think globally and not just regionally when we're talking about the space race competition. I thought that that was really, really important. And on the diplomacy aspect too, and making sure that the US, this wasn't the intel chiefs saying this was like the head of US Space Forces in Europe and Africa. He was saying that like building these relationships in regions like on the continent of Africa is going to be a part of making sure that the US stays ahead in this competition.
Yeah, I saw something recently, it was maybe yesterday, from the Center for Strategic International Studies about the growing military diplomacy of China in Latin America, sort of inviting a lot of students over to learn at China's facilities in a way that is like a five-fold increase maybe compared to the U.S. or something like that, sort of getting at China's interest in Latin America, not even mentioning its economic interest in Africa that are, of course, growing as well. Interesting time for that country as the U.S. is kind of retrenching back home under Trump 2.0. This also reminds me of the Onion headline as we discuss the dynamics of how the Pentagon views the threat from China. This Onion headline from 2022, Pentagon warns Chinese landmass could break off and zoom across the ocean to get us. In terms of, how much is the threat overhyped? How much is it underplayed or whatever? But anyway, I guess time will tell there. We have an administration that's, a little bit more focused on the homeland.
Ben, to your point, and as well to Lauren's point there, I think something that's really interesting that's been conversed about here at AFA is, we've asked questions about how the Air Force last year unveiled this idea of reoptimizing for great power competition. It was a bunch of these key initiatives that were really tied to former Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, and the idea there being that everything needed to be done with the intent and focus on meeting the pacing challenge, which was namely China. Frank Kendall was very famous for saying China, China, China as his top three priorities there. We've seen the tone shift a little bit in that sense, but in a very interesting way. I mean, as you pointed out, and as Defense One has reported, the kind of first priority of the national defense and kind of national security strategies we're seeing is focused on the homeland. So that was one question I asked too of the new Air Force Secretary Troy Menck about this, and I said, if the focus is on the homeland, how are you balancing this? How are you justifying, all of these modernization efforts, and ultimately, kind of what is the focus on those reoptimization efforts? More or less to summarize his answer, which I hope to have out in a story here, is that he labeled everything as being tied to homeland defense in some way. The modernization programs for intercontinental ballistic missiles and the new B-21 bomber and the F-47, all of that in his eyes ties into homeland defense. And I found that to be a really interesting way that he's framing that. Some analysts and experts would obviously disagree that those programs are meant to project force and are meant to, show adversaries that have similar type capabilities or the ability to maybe match that strength, that we are leading the charge there. But this all overall reframing that I think makes clear that there isn't necessarily a set direction, and there's this weirdness that kind of casts a shadow over a conference like AFA when great power competition, like Lauren mentioned, wasn't even mentioned in that one panel, for example. And that's something that has been the messaging so consistently from the last administration. The real question is, what does that guidance look like? And I think the Air Force Secretary is ultimately still trying to figure out what that priority is and what that balance and what trade-offs need to be made to appease the administration's national defense and security objectives, but also to keep justifying the spending on a lot of these modernization programs.
I also do want to tap in and kind of mention when we're talking about like the shift in messaging around homeland defense and focusing on that. There was a panel that was on Golden Dome, but it was renamed to Continental Defense in the 21st Century, which I thought was particularly interesting because it's definitely, I think, part of a trend, at least what I've seen in recent conferences, where there is like this sort of on the go in real time shift, trying to make sure that everybody stays in lockstep with what the Trump administration wants the messaging to be.
Yeah, that is interesting. So was it like on the agenda as Golden Dome, and then when you got there, it's kind of like, oh, we just update new speakers, new people.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, I do believe like the speakers and everybody stayed the same, but it was just like the reference of Golden Dome was taken away and it was replaced with Continental Defense.
That's a great point, Lauren. And I think also to Lauren's point there, we're seeing that the administration's messaging is really seeping down and being discussed. One small thing I've noticed from some top Air Force officials and Space Force officials even is that when they're speaking, they're very consciously saying Department of War or Secretary of War, and even in some instances have caught Air Force officials, slipping up and then correcting. They might say DOD and then say, I mean Department of War. And I think that shows the kind of flexibility that the military is willing to accept and willing to go through to meet that messaging.
Yeah, interesting. Flexibility, deference, obedience, whatever you need for the mission, sir. Now, Tom, I just have 2 questions left for us, but I want to turn now to what you did yesterday. You learned a little bit about some new plans from the Chief of the Space Force. What can you tell us about that?
The Chief of Space Operations, General Chance Saltzman, had a really interesting keynote address followed up by a roundtable with reporters. And the speech was interesting from a couple different aspects. One being that he announced that there's analysts and strategists prepping a document that's titled The Future Operating Environment. And the idea is that this document is going to look all the way to 2040 at what the emerging trends are with threats in space, with adversaries, but also the emerging trends with technology, so that it's something they can look at as this kind of changing document, and they're thinking way down the line about what they need to be focusing on, and what that document will lead them to do is prioritize certain mission sets. Maybe they have to focus more on ISR, or they have to focus more on missile detection. And what they're doing is they're looking further down the road outside of just the immediate threats. The other part of this is he recognizes that this will also allow industry to see where the Space Force is heading, and then they can create those emerging technologies and answers to the problems that they're trying to focus on. So I think that was really interesting. And the speech itself was focused very much so on acquisitions. Saltzman expressed some frustration with the acquisitions process. I have to really suggest, Managing Editor Jennifer Ladd, Defense One, has an incredible piece on Space Force acquisitions. Highly recommend people read it, and it gives a good sense of where the state of Space Force acquisitions is at. I think with this document, he's really trying to set the tone that he wants industry to come to him early and often, and wants to be able to provide those solutions for the Space Force so that they can go and pursue those avenues. And I thought that was a really interesting thing. And also the fact that the document itself is going to change. They said that if every 5 years, they're going to kind of take a look at it again. So, a document in 2030 might be looking at 2045, or so on and so forth. So it'll be like an evolving and moving and changing document, but also shows a lot of foresight from the Space Force to get ahead of a lot of the issues they might be seeing from adversaries.
I think within this point, it's useful to, I guess, remind listeners that the Space Force is probably going to play a huge role in this Golden Dome program, which it's supposed to still feature space-based interceptors, which, from what I understand, haven't been built yet. So that's kind of going to need to be demonstrated, unless I'm incorrect. And then, of course, going through the acquisition process as well.
We know the architecture for Golden Dome has been released. It's highly classified, but we understand that there's still a need for space-based interceptors, and that hasn't been announced.
Yeah, it's highly classified, and it also involves existing systems, knitting them together. So I don't, I mean, it seems like maybe the stitching itself might be classified, but the items that are stitched together are well known, except for this, developing space-based interceptor. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, my very last question to the two of you. What do we know about the Air Force Chief General Alvin's early retirement? Is there anything that we can say publicly? And, lastly, have we, heard much of anything lately about his possible successor?
Ben, that's a great question. I think that has been looming also over this conference. General Alvin gave his last keynote, and it didn't really feel like a farewell speech in some way. And one of the questions is who's going to replace him and who's going to take that role. So that was a question that was asked during a roundtable of the new Air Force Secretary. When we asked about this and also pointed out that there's often delays in the Trump administration getting the nomination process going, the only answer that we got was the bottom line is we will not have a chief. General Alvin and I will make sure that we have a chief, end quote, was what Air Force Secretary Troy Menck said about that. The question is, who is going to replace him? One name that, has been discussed might be General Thomas Bussier of Air Force Global Strike Command. He was submitted as a nominee for vice chief. That nomination was pulled, and it's not clear if maybe it could be resubmitted again for General Alvin's seat. So, yeah, a lot of questions still being answered there, but really the bottom line from the Air Force Secretary is that there will be one, and that General Alvin will make sure that he's a part of that.
For me, I'm most interested in the transition and who the successor will be and what their priorities are going to be, especially when you're talking about incorporating big tech the way all of the military services have been doing, but particularly the Air Force and CCAs. There's this huge push for autonomy in a different way. I'm just curious to see how that's going to manifest beyond the CCA initiative and throughout all of what the Air Force and the Space Force does, because there's no lack of that. I mean, we didn't talk about it here, but there's still discussion of cyber operations, electronic warfare, AI, and being able to train with it accurately so that operators are comfortable with that. I mean, these are things that are not going away. So I want to know who the successor is as much as everybody else, and if they're going to be, read into these things, and these will be issues that they're going to be pushing for more of.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the cyber thing too, since the Trump administration openly said they're going to be doing, quote, offensive cyber, because the predecessors didn't openly do that. So what does that look like? And is the first time you do it, is it going to be easily attributable? And how is the prosecution going to go? Anyway, we'll see how all of that goes. And that's not even including the drone consideration. And like you pointed out, CCAs and, of course, Golden Dome. Lots on these departments' plates. All right, Lauren C. Williams is senior editor at Defense One, and Tom Novelli is Defense One's senior reporter covering air and space warfare. Thanks again to the two of you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben.
Ben, thanks so much. Pleasure to be on.
Well, that's it for us this episode. Thanks for listening, and until next time.
At RTX, we believe no challenge is too great, no question too big, no answer out of reach. That's why we never stop striving. Our global team works across Collins Aerospace, Pratt & Whitney, and Raytheon to inspire, innovate, and drive progress for generations to come. Together, we push the boundaries of known science and find new ways to connect and protect our world. Visit rtx.com to learn more.